Okay. Hi, everyone. We may still have some people filtering in, but I'm going to get started. For those of you who have not been here to a CoastWatch webinar before, thank you for coming. My name is Jessie Jones, and I am the volunteer coordinator for CoastWatch. And we are a mile-by-mile beach adoption program. We've been around for about 25 years, and we connect our volunteers with scientists up and down the West Coast to survey everything from dead birds to sea stars, marine debris. And when the quarantine started, we took our kind of on the beach series and lecture series online. And I met Rebecca back in, gosh, was it November, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we were at a conference at Salishan, and I had learned about Sally Hacker, who I hope is going to be joining us shortly. And Rebecca has this wonderful citizen science project that she's going to share with us tonight. But she has been she is one of many guests who have joined us since our conference was canceled, and since we just have had to take things indoors. So, all right. As I said, real quick, this is CoastWatch. This is our website. If you would like to be involved in adopting a mile, you can contact me, Jessie, at oregonshores.org. We have volunteers up and down the coast from Fort Stevens all the way down to Brookings, providing reports, just simple reports of what they see on the beach. We ask beach walkers to go 4 times a year. And we are a program of Oregon Shores, and Oregon Shores assist beach communities with land use issues, keeping their eye on the coast for many, many years. Philip Johnson is the director of Oregon Shores, and you can contact me or Philip at oregonshores.org for more information about that. And with a membership to Oregon Shores, you can support CoastWatch programs. At this time, as we are looking ahead, we are bringing it to the attention that the state is updating the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. If you would like to know more about this, we are having a webinar on 7 o'clock on Wednesday night, or 6 o'clock actually, sorry, our regular 6 o'clock hour, and we'll have a panel there from the state answering some questions about what this is all about. So, and you can also ask me if you have any questions as well. All right. So I'm going to introduce Rebecca now, and she will also be introducing herself to talk about this beachgrass hunt. I'm going to stop my share and let you get on. And also,
Jessie,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we may have Sally Hacker joining us at some point as well. So she might be popping in. And so if you see a third person, it's not a Zoom bomber, it's Sally. And she'll be with us, hopefully.
And it looks like Sally is here as a participant. I'm seeing her name in that list of participants.
Oh, okay. So we can add her as a panelist, or I can send her a new invite. So
sweet.
Okay. If you want to get started, you may.
Yeah. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. It's fun to look at this list of attendees and see some names that I know and some people I've never met before. So today I'm going to talk about part of my dissertation that I'm working on at Oregon State University. And the title of the talk is A Wild Grass Chase, Hybrid Beachgrass Discovery on the Pacific Northwest Dunes. So thanks to you all for being here, and thanks to Jessie for coordinating this talk and what seems like a great speaker series so far. So thank you all. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to go through the story of an unexpected discovery that's been unfolding on the Oregon Coast Dunes for about the past 8 years. And so the arc of the story that I'm going to tell today is we're going to start with talking about the cast of characters, so who's involved in this story. Then we're going to dive into some Pacific Northwest dune natural history, although maybe we should call it unnatural history, because many of the plants I'm going to talk about today are actually invasive or non-native plants. Then we'll get into the botany of desire. Don't come at me, Michael Pollan. But really, we're going to talk about plant hybridization as part of that desire. And then we'll think about this unexpected discovery that I'm foreshadowing and the consequences of that discovery in the next steps of our sort of scientific journey. But before we go any further, I just want to take a quick poll. So how many people have read Dune, the novel? What you can do in Zoom, since I can't see your faces, is you can raise your Zoom hand. I think people are able to raise their Zoom hands if you go into the participant list. Oh yes, here we go. Okay, the results are coming in. So figure out how to raise your Zoom hand and let me know if you've read Dune. I'll just tell you that Dune is a sci-fi novel all about a planet covered in sand, covered in dunes. It was like this ecology sci-fi novel, one of the first, very exciting. And what people might not know is that Frank Herbert actually lived in Salem and spent some time on the Oregon coast dunes and was inspired by our dune system to write a book all about this incredible world. Cool. Okay, thanks everyone for logging in and letting me know. I'll have a couple more of those, like raise your hand. I'm more of an interactive speaker, and so webinars are a little bit of a challenge for me. So it looks like maybe half of you have read Dune, so I'm gonna reduce my jokes about sandworms and Arrakis by like 50%, and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's dive into this story. I told you we're gonna start with the characters, so I guess we'll start with me. My name is Rebecca Mostow. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and then I moved to Ohio to study biology. And I've really always been a scientific omnivore. I studied lots of different things in college, including desert plant phylogenetics and seabird ecology and kelp reproduction. And eventually I went on to study sort of plant restoration techniques. And I spent some time at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center, which is where I first started to do sort of marine animal husbandry. It's where I spent a lot of time with my head in a tank like this. And actually, I think Zofia Kanorik, whose head is right here, is here in the audience. So hi, Zo. And the Marine Science Center was actually where I first encountered citizen science or community-based science. And it's where I really discovered the value of that type of project. And I decided that when I went on to continue my scientific career, I would want to incorporate citizen science. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is that next step, which is that I started a PhD at Oregon State a couple years ago. And this is part of the project that I'm working on. So another very important player in this story is Dr. Sally Hacker, who is my advisor, and I will make zero jokes about. So Sally is here, and maybe you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sally Hacker. I am a professor at Oregon State University, and I have been studying dunes for, I guess, 15 years now, since 2006. Pacific Northwest dunes, and in particular looking at the role of beach grasses in kind of forming dunes and providing ecosystem services for dunes. So this story that Rebecca's going to tell today is based on her PhD work, but behind the scenes, there's a whole bunch of research that we've done on these beach grasses that she'll be telling you about today. And so I'm gonna just let her take it over. But thanks for coming.
Thanks, Sally. So the other important people involved in this story is just a note that science like this, any kind of project, takes a village. It takes a ton of people to do the kind of work that I'm going to talk about today. So here are the faces of some of the people who've worked with me. A bunch of them are Oregon State University undergrads that have done part of their like senior project or undergrad project on the work that I'm talking about. And some of them are people who've been out in the field with me and helped with field work. And some of them are professors at OSU. I'll highlight a couple people. Here's Peter Ruggiero, who is a collaborator of our lab in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State. So anytime you hear me say anything about dune shape or dune morphology, anything like that, that's part of the collaboration with Peter. That's what I'll be highlighting. And then down here is Felipe Barreto, and also a professor at OSU. And anytime you hear me say anything about genetics or genome size, anything in that world, that is in collaboration with Felipe Barreto. So lots of thanks to all of these people who make the kind of integrative science that I'm going to talk about today possible. All right, so now it's time to dive into this unnatural natural history. So let's start with thinking about the system that we're talking about today, and that is the Pacific Northwest coastal dunes. So the native state of the dunes on the Oregon and Washington coasts looks something like this black and white picture in the background here. It's low, hummocky, sparsely vegetated, and lots of plant diversity. So I've highlighted some of our native plants in color around the outside, and those are just a few of the like incredibly diverse plants that we might find on a native dune ecosystem. This is also a really dynamic ecosystem. There's constantly sand blowing around everywhere and changing the shape of these like little hummocky dunes. So this is what the dunes and the sand fields on the Oregon coast looked like until around the early 1900s. And in the 1900s, people started to move out to the Oregon coast and try to build these sort of like stable settlements and like towns and houses really close to the dunes. And they realized that the shifting sand environment was not the best place to build a community. And so people started introducing and planting beach grasses. And beach grasses are grasses that are adapted to grow in sand and build these tall, stable, linear, densely vegetated dunes. And so the color picture in the background, like that's what our dune systems on a lot of the Oregon coast look like now. Pretty densely vegetated, pretty much vegetated by one type of grass just growing all the way along it. And these beach grasses were planted and then spread well outside of the areas in which they were planted. And I just want to give you a sense of the scale of change that we're talking about from the introduction of these beach grasses. So on the left, we have these black and white photos of sort of pre-beachgrass introduction or early beachgrass introduction in Pacific City, Oregon. And then on the right, there are these color photos showing sort of more modern what these beaches look like. And what you can see is that in the early and mid 1900s, there's tons of white, there's tons of this open sand environment. And then in 2012, there's lots of green. There's lots of these sort of linear dune systems. And not only are these beaches densely vegetated, they're also densely populated. So you can see, I'm looking at these sort of like linear dune ridges that are protecting the coastal communities built behind them and making it possible for us to have a city like Pacific City on this sandy spit. So huge scale of change on our coast. And beachgrass planting has had some really positive consequences for the coastline. So the dunes that these beachgrasses build provide coastal protection. So coastal protection is just basically houses that are behind the dunes. The dunes almost act like a green seawall or something like that. They're a barrier between the houses and the shoreline. So they protect the houses from high wind, maybe waves or storm surge, anything like that. These dunes are providing that protection. And also they're increasing the sand stability. So you can imagine that without these grasses, the sand would just be blowing everywhere and would be piling up on people's doorsteps like it used to. So these are the positive consequences of the beachgrass introduction, but there have also been negative consequences. So these beachgrasses outcompete native plants and have spread well outside of the range of their initial introduction. And by doing that, they actually decrease the native plant species richness. So they outcompete the plants and the native plants have nowhere to go. And they've actually contributed to the declines of some threatened and endangered plants. And the beachgrass spread also decreases the habitat for the western snowy plover and has contributed dramatically to its decline. The western snowy plover is a shorebird here on the Pacific Northwest. And they really like to nest in unvegetated, sort of like sandy spots, and so they really do not like the beach grasses that vegetate almost everything. So there's positive consequences of the beachgrass introduction that make it possible for so many people to live on the coast, but there have also been these negative consequences for biodiversity. So I told you about these beachgrass introductions, but I haven't mentioned yet that there's actually two closely related species of grasses that were introduced to the Pacific Northwest. So one of them is Ammophila arenaria, and I'm showing you this map from one of my lab mates, Ruben Beal. Ammophila arenaria is shown as white circles in this map, and it's most prevalent in the south. It was actually mostly planted in California and Oregon, and so that's where it's mostly the dominant grass. And Ammophila breviligulata, which is shown in black on this map, was planted mostly in Washington, and it's mostly the dominant plant in Washington and sort of north from there. So the two species of grass overlap in their range, like they both occur on a beach, from around like southern Washington to northern Oregon. You can find both of them together. And these two species of grasses, although they look pretty similar, they have differential effects on dune morphology, so the shape of the dunes, coastal protection, so the ability of those dunes to protect the communities built behind them from storm surge and waves, and biodiversity, so the diversity of plants and animals that can live on the dunes. So now we're going to sort of zoom in on those two species and think about what the differences of them between them are. So our two species are Ammophila arenaria, or European beachgrass, and Ammophila breviligulata, or American beachgrass. So Ammophila arenaria, European beachgrass, is native to Western Europe and invasive in Oregon, and actually invasive in a lot of places around the world. It's been planted on a lot of different sandy and duney systems. So you can find it in a lot of places all over. And Ammophila breviligulata, American beachgrass, is native to the US northeast, so the like northeast Atlantic coast, as well as the Midwest, so the Great Lakes dunes. If you've ever been to the Great Lakes, there's these huge dunes there, so that are obviously not salty, that might be where this grass originated. So that's a pretty neat invasion that it's been introduced from there. Note the common names of these plants are a little bit confusing. So European beachgrass is native to Europe, that's clear, but American beachgrass is native to the US East Coast and is not native to Oregon and is invasive here, but its common name throws people off a lot because they'll hear American beachgrass and think that it must be native, but it's not native to here, it's native to another part of America, so common names are confusing and we're going to use their Latin names, sorry. These grasses are very similar morphologically in the way that they look, but there are a couple features that are really good for helping to identify and distinguish between them. And one of them is the ligule. So a ligule is just a little thin membranous piece of tissue between the leaf blade and the stem. So here I've shown it on the slide here, and also here is where it is in the illustration of Ammophila arenaria. So right at the intersection between the leaf blade and the stem. So I like to think of it as the grass armpit hair. I don't know if that's helpful for other people, but it's helpful for me. So Ammophila arenaria has this long pointy ligule or very long armpit hair, and then Ammophila breviligulata has a very short, flat top ligule. So these are really, this is like the most important character feature for being able to identify between these two species or tell them apart. And speaking of Latin names, you might notice that Ammophila breviligulata, the Latin name brevi means short and ligulata is just liguled. And so the Latin name Ammophila breviligulata really just means that it's the short liguled Ammophila. So that can be a helpful way to remember which species is which if you're into Latin and Latin names, which I am, so maybe you are too. Okay, so now we're going to talk about these plants. They look a little bit different and they have different effects on the shape of the dunes. So Ammophila arenaria builds these tall and steep dunes, and Ammophila breviligulata builds shorter and shallower dunes. And the reason for this is that Ammophila arenaria grows more densely. So the stems come up more closely together, and so the dunes it builds end up being taller and steeper. Whereas Ammophila breviligulata, its stems are more widely spaced, and so the dunes that it builds are sort of wider and shallower. And dunes dominated by Ammophila arenaria tend to have a greater plant species richness than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And the research that I just summarized comes from Sally in our lab in the early 2010s. So there's another grass that you might see out on the Oregon coast, which is Lamus mollis, or American dune grass. And this is actually our native grass. And notice once again that the common name is confusing. So this is American dune grass, which is different from American beach grass, even though those sound exactly the same. So again, we're going to stick with the Latin name. So this is Lamus mollis, and it's our native grass, and it's, I think, a truly beautiful grass. And maybe I'm the only one who thinks that grasses are beautiful, but this one really is. It's got these thick stems and wide leaf blades and sort of a blue-gray tinge to it. It's very lovely to see it out on the beaches. And American dune grass, Lamus mollis, also builds dunes, but they're not the tall, linear, stable dunes that we sort of think about and associate with the Oregon coast. They're these sort of natural system, the low, hummocky, rolling dunes. And so these dunes are not very densely vegetated. The stems are spread out pretty widely, and there's really high plant species richness. And the dunes built by Lamus mollis have something that the dunes built by the Ammophila species don't, which is high habitat value. So there's our little western snowy plover happily nesting on dunes dominated by Lamus mollis in those little swales in between the little hummocks. So all of the things that I have summarized thus far are things that were discovered by our lab primarily by conducting these long-term monitoring surveys. And so these surveys are this incredible treasure trove of data that Sally and the lab have collected over many years. And what they are is that that map, you can see all of those little triangles represent sites where we do the long-term monitoring surveys. And every 3 years, somebody from the lab goes out to each of those little triangles and does surveys of the dune plant ecology and the dune morphology, so the shape of the dune. And so the way we do that is we lay a transect perpendicular to the shoreline, so like over the sort of hump of the dune, over the profile of the dune. And we use a GPS backpack. So there's my lab mate, Katya, with her GPS backpack on. And no, she is not signaling to aliens, which is what we always get asked. She is tracking the shape of the dune. So she has that backpack on is telling her not just where she is in place, but sort of how high she is. And so from that GPS track, we can get a shape of the dune. And then while she was doing that, I would be doing the dune plant community survey. So I would put down those little quadrats and count all of the plant stems that were in the quadrat and identify all of the different plant species that were in there. And from those two different types of data, we can figure out, is there a relationship between the type of the plants that are growing on the dune and the shape of the dune? And we found out, just as I summarized above, that there is. So it was actually in 2012 that Ruben Beal, a lab mate of mine, was doing one of these surveys, and he found this plant that was just sort of weird looking. It looked like Ammophila breviligulata. It had sort of thicker stems and thicker leaf blades, but it had a longish ligule, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. And but it looked weird. It looked different sort of between the two species, but also it was the only plant that was flowering on the dune at that point. So he looked at that and he collected some and he thought, like, what is this? Could this be a hybrid between these two species? And so that question, could this be a hybrid? That is really like where our story begins. That is sort of the beginning of my dissertation work and where really the meat of this story goes. So before we dive into that, we'll just talk about hybridization real fast. So a hybrid is the offspring of parents from two different species. So no, this is not what we're talking about. This is regularly what I get asked. We're talking about this kind of hybrid. So a hybrid is a cross between two species. So one you might be familiar with is a horse crossed with a donkey is a mule, right? Maybe after Tiger King phenomenon, you're also familiar with the idea that a lion crossed with a tiger is a liger. So these are animal examples, but there are also tons of plant examples, and plants are actually more willing to hybridize than animals most of the time. So you've probably encountered some of these plant examples in the grocery store. A pluot or a tangelo, if you've ever bought one of those, you've bought a hybrid plant. So a pluot is a plum crossed with an apricot. A tangelo is a pomelo crossed with a tangerine. So hybridization, it's fairly common. But what I've shown you here are all sort of artificial hybridization events, right? Hybridization events produced by humans on purpose, artificial crosses. But actually, hybridization is a natural phenomenon as well. Natural hybridization happens in animals, in birds and salamanders and butterflies. These are some of our sort of like model systems, warblers and salamanders and the heliconius butterfly. But hybridization also happens in plants, and plants are much more likely to be sneakily getting into hybridization. So sunflowers are like classic example of a hybrid system. Plants that are just kind of willing to cross across many different species barriers and don't seem to mind much. And I've also shown some irises up here, which are a common model system. So natural hybridization can happen in plants. And one group of plants that is well known for its ability to hybridize are the grasses. So to understand if hybridization even could be happening on this dune, we need to know, okay, do these plants overlap? And I showed you that they overlapped sort of at this large spatial scale by showing this map, but they also overlap at the smallest spatial scale. So they grow right next to each other. This is a dune with Ammophila breviligulata dominated, and then a little patch of Ammophila arenaria. And maybe you can tell from this photo that Ammophila arenaria is growing much more densely, right? Those stems are making this little hummock on the dune, whereas Ammophila breviligulata in the background is much more widely spaced. And not only do these two species grow right next to each other on the dune, they also flower right next to each other on the dune. So these are grass flowers, if you've never seen them before, haven't recognized them before. And you can see that it's Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria flowering right next to each other. I guess maybe you can't see that because you can't see the ligule, and now you know how to identify them. But I identified them, I promise. That's what you're seeing. So there are a couple other things to think about when we sort of wonder if hybridization is even possible in this system. And one factor that favors hybridization is that we know that both of these Ammophila species hybridize in their native range with a different species, with some Calamagrostis species, so another closely related grass. So they're both like susceptible to hybridization in their native ranges, but no Ammophila arenaria, Ammophila breviligulata cross has ever been documented or found. And that probably has to do with the fact that we're pretty sure that the Pacific Northwest is the only place in the world where these two species co-occur at this level. Remember that they're both non-native, right? So they were both introduced from other places here together. And so this is a very unique range overlap between these two species. Another factor that favors hybridization is that these two species have the same number of chromosomes. So they're sort of genetically compatible in a way that might make them susceptible to hybridization. So I set out to investigate this hybrid. The question I was asking is really like, is this a weird plant that Ruben found on the dune? Is this a hybrid between these two species? And if it is a hybrid, what does that mean? What's going to happen next? And so the next part of the talk, I'm just going to go through these different questions and sort of lines of inquiry that I asked about the hybrid. And this is pretty much the order that I actually did them in real life. So the first thing that I did was investigate the morphology. I asked, like, does this weird plant look different from the two parent species? Then we looked at the phenology. I asked, does it flower at a different time than the parents? We looked at the genome size. How big is its genome? How does that relate to the parents? We did some genetic work. So I sequenced some of the DNA and looked at how related it is to the parents. And finally, we've been mapping the range of the hybrid. So how much of it is out there and where is it? So we're going to start with morphology. So to investigate the morphology of this hybrid, what we did, and this is me and Ruben and a bunch of undergrads, is we collected hundreds of plants from the field, from the places where we could find this hybrid, and we collected the hybrid and the parent species, and we measured a suite of traits. And some of those traits are important for the dune building potential of the plants, and some of the traits are just like important for being able to identify and tell them apart. So I told you that the ligule of the Ammophila species is important for identifying them, right? And we found that the hybrid has an intermediate length ligule. We also found that the hybrid has an intermediate number of shoots per plant, intermediate blade width between the two parent species. But we also found that the hybrid exceeded its parents in some traits. So it was like bigger than its parents in some traits. It has higher below ground biomass than its parents, and it's taller than its parents. The shoots are longer. And this might not be surprising, right? When you think about like a mule is it's larger than either a donkey or a horse, and some people think it's like a stronger draft animal. That's hybrid vigor, which is the tendency for hybrids to be sort of bigger and stronger than their parent species. So maybe these exceptional traits aren't that expected. So here's just a little bit of the data from the morphology project. So on the x-axis, I have the species. So AMAR means Ammophila arenaria. That's the code we use for Ammophila arenaria. HYBR is the hybrid, and an AMBR, that's Ammophila breviligulata. That's the code we use for the Ammophila breviligulata. And then on the y-axis, we have the trait that we measured, right? So there's ligule length, and you can see Ammophila arenaria, very long ligule, very long armpit hair, Ammophila breviligulata, very short ligule, and then the hybrid is intermediate right there in the middle. Here's the graph for blade width. Again, we find that the hybrid is intermediate between the parent species. Here's our shoot height, so the height from sort of the base of the plant to the very tip. And we see that the hybrid is taller than both species. And that was a pretty exciting realization. And here's number of shoots per plant, so the number of sort of stems coming out from a single plant. And we see that the hybrid is intermediate between the parent species, but not statistically different when you look compare, but it's statistically the same as Ammophila breviligulata. So that's a pretty interesting discovery. Okay, so we did this morphology study. We see that the hybrid is different physically from the parent species, and we can quantify those differences. So then I moved on to phenology. So remember, phenology is just the flowering time. And I'm asking, I know that the two parent species flower, they overlap a little bit in their flowering time. And I'm wondering, when does the hybrid flower and does it overlap with the parents? And so to assess phenology, I just went to 4 sites up and down the Oregon and Washington coast. And I visited those sites every 2 weeks for the whole flowering season of these plants. And every time I went out there, I surveyed just the number of flowering stalks that I could find. So here's the data from the phenology survey. So on the x-axis, you have the date. So that's just the date that I went out into the field and did that survey. And then on the y-axis is the number of flowering stalks that I was finding per area. And so you can see I'm just showing you Ammophila arenaria flowering. And so Ammophila arenaria flowering peaks around the beginning of July, right? That's when the most flowers are happening. And you can see like, okay, we're here like in mid-June. If we went out in mid-June, if we went out to the beach right now, we would see some flowering stalks starting and some flowering stalks fully open, but not peak flowering yet. And actually I've been out and seen that that's like right around the stage that we are. So that's an exciting thing to see. So there's Ammophila arenaria. I'm gonna lay Ammophila breviligulata right on top of it. So you can see Ammophila breviligulata flowers later in the season than Ammophila arenaria. It peaks around late August. And there's some overlap between their flowering time. So we're saying, okay, there's this potential for hybridization or crossing happening right in here when both species are flowering. And so now I'm going to lay the hybrid curve on top of it. And here's the flowering for the hybrid. So what you can see is that the hybrid peaks at a different time than either species. It's peaking around mid-July, and it overlaps with both parent species. So this was a pretty exciting thing to see after a very long field season of going out to these sites every 2 weeks, that the hybrid has a distinct flowering time and that it overlaps with both parent species. So that opens up the possibility for back crossing, so reproduction between the hybrid and the parent species as a possibility, something that we might see. And we can see sort of how likely hybridization is to keep happening on the dunes. Another important thing to note is that the hybrid is flowering at a slightly different time than the parents, and so that can help us find it. If the hybrid is the only thing flowering on the dune, we're more likely to be able to just sort of walk along the beach and go check everything that's flowering and find more of the hybrid. So we looked at phenology. We do see some interesting differences between the hybrid and the parents. Then I moved on to measuring the genome size of the hybrid and the parent species. And so what I did is I basically measured the amount of DNA in cells from the individuals from these three different groups. So individuals from Ammophila arenaria, the hybrid, and Ammophila breviligulata. And what I found is that Ammophila arenaria has this kind of smaller genome size, Ammophila breviligulata has a larger genome size, and the hybrid has this almost perfectly intermediate genome size, which is a pretty cool thing to see. What this says to me is that this is very likely a first generation hybrid that got half of its DNA from one parent and half from the other parent. And so it is sort of 50-50 first generation hybrid. So once I did this genome size analysis and I saw that this really did look like an F1 hybrid, I was pretty gung-ho that we needed to do some genetic analysis to figure out really put the nail in the coffin, like, is this a hybrid or not? So the next thing I did was I sequenced some DNA from the parent species and from the hybrid. And I'm not going to talk too much about the methods that I used to do this sequencing, but I love talking about that. So if you want to ask me about it later, feel free. I'm happy to talk to you. But what I did here is I took individuals from these parent species and from the hybrid, I sequenced some of their DNA, and then I put all that data into a computer program that sort of assigned them into groups. And so I'm showing all of the Ammophila arenaria samples. Those are like samples 1 through 10. Those all got sorted into the red group. They're all being colored red. Each of those columns is an individual, and the color is sort of what group they're in. So Ammophila arenaria is all getting sorted into red. Ammophila breviligulata is all getting sorted into blue. So the computer program is saying these are 2 separate groups. And then when we look at the hybrid, what we can see is that for each of those columns, the computer program is saying they belong half in the Ammophila breviligulata group and half in the Ammophila arenaria group. So this is some pretty compelling evidence that in fact these are first generation hybrids that have half of their DNA from one parent and half from the other parent. So at this point, we can be pretty sure that what we're looking at on the dunes is in fact a first generation hybrid between these 2 non-native parent species growing on the Oregon coast. And so the next question that we really need to ask is, like, how much of this plant is out there? How much of this hybrid is there? Is this something we really need to think about, or is there just like a couple isolated patches of it that aren't a big deal? So this is, again, we're going to zoom in on the range overlap between the 2 species. So going from around Pacific City to up past Grace Harbor, Washington into Ocean Shores area. So here's that range overlap, and the purple dots are the sites where we have found the hybrid. And so this is 2012 to 2014. Here are the 4 sites where we knew that the hybrid occurred. And this is sort of the initial original data set. So then between 2017 and 2018, I had started working on my PhD. I was kind of keeping my eyes peeled for it. And so I found a couple more sites where the hybrid existed. And then one of our sites, this is Grayland, Washington, right here. One of our sites there eroded, which is what you get for working on a sandy coastline. So that site is gone, but we found another site on Grayland. And then between 2018 and 2019, I started surveying for the hybrid with sort of more focus. And you can see that I found even more sites. Now we're talking about 11, 12 sites where the hybrid occurs in Oregon and Washington. And pretty much where I looked, not everywhere, but many of the places where I looked for the hybrid, I found it, which is exciting and perhaps a little nerve-wracking that there's definitely more of the hybrid out there than I've found. So just to orient you, the furthest north site, that's Ocean City, Ocean Shores area. Furthest south site is Pacific City, Oregon. And you might see these like big gaps in this map, like big white areas where you're like, is the hybrid not there? What's going on? those are mostly just areas that I haven't surveyed yet. So I'm just one person and I can only cover so much beach ground in a summer season. And so you can see like Grace Harbor, there's this big gap. I just really have not been back to Grace Harbor and really looked for the hybrid. Long Beach, there's a lot of gap. And then there's this big area between Fort Stevens and Pacific City where the hybrid could be, but I just haven't covered enough ground in that area to know yes or no it's there or not. So we definitely need more data about where the hybrid is. All right, so looking back at this sort of like checklist for my investigation, I looked at the morphology of the plant and found that the hybrid is distinct between the parent species, distinct from the parent species, and we can sort of quantify that difference. I looked at the flowering time of the hybrid. It has a different flowering time from the parents. I looked at the genome size. It has an intermediate size genome, and we sequenced the DNA, and it is in fact a hybrid. And then we looked at the range of the hybrid and found that we really need more data about the range of this hybrid on the coast. We found more of it than had originally been identified, but we really can't say how much more there is out there. So when we add all of that information together, all of those pieces of data, the conclusion that we come to is exciting and maybe a little bit surprising, which is that the Ammophila beachgrasses are hybridizing on the Pacific Northwest coast. And this discovery comes with some pretty significant potential consequences. So remember that I told you that the dunes on the Oregon and Washington coast are built by these beach grasses, and the dunes provide coastal protection to the communities behind them. So we have a new grass potentially spreading on our coast, at least present in more areas than we know of right now. And that grass has completely unknown consequences for the shape of the dunes, these dunes that are protecting homes, and also for the ability of those dunes to protect the houses. So we really don't have a sense of how this hybrid is going to affect coastal protection, but the Oregon coast dunes are critical structures for the protection of communities. So we need to understand what the effect of the spread of this hybrid could be. We also don't know how this hybrid is going to affect the biodiversity of the dunes. So remember I told you that the beach grasses outcompete native plants, but that they do so at sort of different levels. And we don't know whether the hybrid is going to outcompete native plants more, maybe less. We don't understand the way that this hybrid could affect the conservation of biodiversity on our coastline. There are also potential consequences for the population genetics of the parent species. So hybrids, especially plant hybrids, have a tendency to be invasive, to be even more invasive than their parent species. And many invasive plant species have some history of hybridization in their lineage. And so there's a possibility that this hybrid could itself be highly invasive, or that we could find that crossing between the hybrid and the parent species facilitates gene flow between the two species and changes the population genetics of the two species. So that is a huge possibility for a change in the invasion dynamics on the Oregon and Washington coasts. And the final potential consequence is that there could be ecological interactions between this hybrid and the parent species. So the hybrid could be competing with the parents or facilitating them, again, affecting this sort of invasion dynamics on this coast. So although I am just sort of like stoked to have discovered a hybrid on the coast and sort of found this new interesting piece of scientific evidence, it's important not to lose fact of the site that this discovery is happening in an ecosystem that provides a lot to the communities around it. And we need to keep our eye on the effect that this hybrid could have on coastal communities, biodiversity conservation, invasion biology, all of that. So science is iterative, and every good discovery leads to more questions. And so here are some of the questions that I'm asking now after having discovered this hybrid. The big one sitting in my mind is really how much of this hybrid is out there and where is it? To understand the potential consequences of this hybrid, we have to know how much is out there, and we have to have as many sites as we can to investigate the effect of the hybrid on the beach. So this question is really central to the next steps in our investigation. How much is out there? Where is it? The next question is like, how is the hybrid interacting with its parent species? Is it competing with them? Is it facilitating them? And finally, how is this hybrid going to affect dune shape and habitat value on the coast? So the ways that I'm investigating these questions, the first question is I'm hoping to use community or citizen-based scientists to understand how much of the hybrid is out there and map it. I'm using a common garden experiment at the Hatfield Marine Science Center to investigate those sort of species interactions between the parents and the hybrids. And there's another grad student starting in our lab who's going to do more dune surveys of the sites where the hybrid occurs to understand the effect of the hybrid on dune shape and habitat value. So for the rest of the talk, for the last little bit of the talk, I'm going to zoom in on this question of how much of this hybrid is out there and how I'm hoping to investigate that. So this is the part that I'm calling the wild grass chase, because my goal is to use community science, citizen scientists to survey beaches on the Oregon and Washington coasts for the Ammophila hybrid beachgrass, so we can really understand how much is out there. And I'm doing this in partnership with Oregon Shores, Oregon Coast Watch, which I'm so grateful for that partnership. And we're hosting all of this information on iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is a social network whose goals are to connect people to nature and generate scientifically valuable biodiversity data. So again, if we could actually just do a quick show of hands, how many people have actually used iNaturalist in the past? If you can just raise your Zoom hand real quick. Cool. Okay, as these results are coming in, I'll tell you a little bit more about iNaturalist. It is a platform by which you can submit observations of living things. Okay, so it looks like a few people have used iNaturalist, but not a ton. Cool. Okay, so iNaturalist is this platform. You can submit observations of the living things you encounter in your life. And I think you can submit everything except for like people. So really, the world is your oyster, or like you can submit pictures of oysters, that's fine, onto iNaturalist. And so the idea is that every observation has a picture associated with it, and a location, and a date, and a potential identification. So imagine you take a picture of the bird that you see outside and you submit it as like a robin. And then the way that the social network part of it works is that if I submit a picture of a robin, then other people can see that and verify my identification and agree or disagree. They can say, yes, that's a robin, or like, no, that's a towhee, or whatever they want to say. And so that's how we get this sort of like community teamwork learning community on iNaturalist. And the value of iNaturalist, the way you can think about it is like, if I just see a robin and I take a picture of it and just record it, that's just a single data point in time, right? That's like one person's identification. But if I identify it and then people agree with my identification, and then those people go out and identify robins, and then 1,000 more people go out and identify robins, because that's really what we're talking about with iNaturalist, is thousands of people engaged in this. What you get is not just one data point, but something that starts to look more like a range map, a map of the presence of robins, or even maybe the migratory routes of robins, or whatever. It's similar in that way to eBird, in that like all of the observations come together to build something that's really scientifically valuable. So I'm showing just the search page of iNaturalist. If you search for marram grasses, again, this is another moment where common names are becoming a problem. iNaturalist uses the common name marram grass for our beach grasses, and that's because that is the common name in Europe. So most of the world calls these grasses marram grasses. So anyway, use Latin names. But so if you search for marram grasses or genus Ammophila in iNaturalist, this is what you would see, which is that all of those little squares are places, observations where someone has seen a marram grass and uploaded it. And just one of those squares is interesting, but altogether they form this range map. And we can start to see like, oh, the Ammophila beachgrasses are present all along the west coast of the US and on the northern east coast and in the Great Lakes region. And then look over in Europe, there's tons of them. And there's some in South America that we should investigate further. So we start to see more of like a range map. And so in iNaturalist, the way that I'm sort of compiling all of our data is I built a project. And basically this project is just a place that's collecting, it's a page, a web page that's collecting all of the observations of any Ammophila beachgrass found in the Pacific Northwest and sort of storing them all together. So you can go to this project page. If you go to iNaturalist projects and you search for hybrid beachgrass, this will be the only thing that comes up. So you can find it pretty easily. And you can look at all the observations that people made. You can see where people have found the 2 different species. You can submit an observation yourself. And also if you click on that about section, you can get some more information. So I made this identification guide for the beach grasses, and it includes sort of pictures of the beach grasses and their ranges, as well as some identification tips. So a reminder to check the ligules and to look at their ranges, but also a note that if you don't know what grass you're looking at, that's okay. You can just submit it as genus Ammophila. And that's the amazing thing about iNaturalist, is that I will be able to see it and sort of edit the identification, and maybe some of your peers will be able to see it and edit your identification, and we'll explain how to do the ID with the information that you've shared with us. And so it becomes sort of a teaching and learning tool. Okay. So if you want to get involved in mapping this beach grass on the Pacific Northwest coast, maybe you're somebody who has a Coast Watch mile, and so you're already going to be out on the beach a lot this summer. Or maybe you're somebody who lives on the beach or who vacations to the beach, any of those things. Maybe you're just happen to be out on a dune and you want to see if you can help. The first thing to do is to check out that project page. Again, you can just search in iNaturalist hybrid beachgrass, and the project, if you search in the project section, the project page will come up, and the link is next. So you can check out the project page and read about the plants. Then practice submitting an observation. So you can submit observations on the website, or you can download an app onto your phone that's like pretty user friendly, and then you can upload observations that way. So that's a fun way to do it too. And submit anything. You can just practice submitting an observation of a living thing that you happen to see in your yard, just to get the hang of it. And then next time you're out on the beach, try to identify the beach grasses you see. Try to find that ligule and pull out your little ID guide and see if you can figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, or you can and you don't really want to use iNaturalist, that's totally fine. I would still love your help if you're willing to look at the beach grasses on the beach, but don't want to interface with iNaturalist. That's fine. You can always just email me. I'm going to have my email in the next slide. And so you can always just email me photos of the beach grasses that you happen to see, and I will super happily integrate those into the project. And if you're really engaged and really excited to get involved and want to learn more about identifying grasses and look more closely at the grasses and talk more seriously about that, we're going to do a training webinar on June 29th at 11 a.m. So that's 2 weeks, 2 Mondays from now. That last Monday in June at the same time, we're going to do a training webinar where we'll spend more time practicing submitting observations, thinking about where on the dunes we might look for these plants, and really looking closely at the plants. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all, even though I can't see your faces. And I would like to thank Jesse for inviting me, and the Oregon Shores, Oregon Coast Watch team. It's such a pleasure to work with you all. And then, as I said before, research is such a team effort. So thanks to the research support that I've gotten from professors, fieldwork help from undergrads and other graduate students, the grass measuring team, undergrads who've done all this work. The research that I've presented here was conducted primarily on the traditional homelands of the Clallam, Makah, Quileute, Chinook, Hoe, Quinault, Chehalis, Lower Chinook, Tillamook, Siletz, and Mystica people. So huge, immense gratitude. And finally, funding for this project is coming from Oregon Sea Grant, is a very important funder for us, and the National Science Foundation, the Washington Native Plant Society, among other places. So with that, I think that I'll open it up to questions, and I've got my information up on the slide if people want to reach out separately. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rebecca. There was one question so far. If you want to pull it up in the Q&A, I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
That. There was an answered, I just privately answered that theirs will be answered first, and then there might be another open question. So the first one was actually from anonymous attendee. Do you see that one?
Oh yeah, so this question is there a possibility that the hybrid could eventually become its own species, or is it more likely that it will continue to serve as a stepping stone for gene flow between the parents? If it is possible, could you identify and predict how many parent generations it would take under different environmental conditions? This is a great question, and maybe gets us sort of wrapped up into species concept questions. So without diving too deep into that world, there's like a lot of debate among scientists about how we define a species and what we mean when we talk about a species. For this sort of question, I think the way that I would interpret that is thinking about whether the hybrid could, sort of independent from new hybridization events, persist in this area. Maybe they're asking, could the hybrid develop sexual reproduction and be able to sexually reproduce with itself sort of for a long-term period? Those are sort of slightly different things, and the answer to the question is maybe. Hybrid speciation events are not uncommon. There is some evidence that there's actually an ancient hybridization event led to the speciation of these two Ammophila species. There's an ancient lineage hybridization event. So clearly it's been an important part of the evolution of these species. The way that hybrids often become their own species or develop this sexual reproduction has to do with one way that often happens is a doubling of the number of chromosomes that they have, called allopolyploidy. So just doubling the amount of DNA that they have can allow them to have normal sexual reproduction and recombination. We don't see that in any of the hybrids that we're looking at now. So for right now, what we're looking at is a hybrid that we think can only spread rhizomatously, only spread via asexually with these stems spreading underground. But the possibility that it could develop sexual reproduction or become its own sexually reproducing species is definitely there, which is another reason to closely study it, because what if we could get to see that in action? That would be an amazing discovery. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, and then there's another question, or two questions from John French. And the first one, have you located any sites, even small areas, where the hybrid is dominant? If so, any particular characteristics of those hybrid dominant sites?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks. So we have not found what I would call a site where the hybrid is dominant over a large area. Usually what I find when I find the hybrid are these almost like a hummock, a super, super dense patch of grasses that are between, the largest one that I found that's really like that, just a dense patch of grasses, was about like 3 meters by 3 meters generally. So fairly large, and those tend to have tons of dead material, so dead plant material in them, which I'm not really sure why that is, but that's definitely a characteristic that I've noticed in the hybrid. There is one site where we find the hybrid isn't dominant, but it is widely spread and grows sort of stems right next to the other parent species, and it spreads across almost a 1/4 mile of dune where it's like widely spread out. It's not the dominant grass there, and so it's hard to say how it's affecting dune shape. But one of the reasons why we need to sort of look for the hybrid more is to assess whether there are sites where the hybrid is dominant? Or even at sites where it's co-dominant, can we compare the shape of the dune where the hybrid exists with the shape of the dune where it isn't?
Okay, great question, John. And then can you see that second question, Rebecca?
Yeah, so the question is about the biodiversity. So it says, it seems odd that Ammophila arenaria covers dunes more densely than Ammophila breviligulata, but has higher plant species biodiversity. Could you comment? Yeah. It does seem a little bit counterintuitive. One potentially confounding factor there is that Ammophila arenaria is the dominant grass further south, and there's not a ton of overlap, and so maybe southern dunes tend to have more biodiversity or more plant biodiversity. But yeah, I'm not sure what the mechanism is that explains that higher plant biodiversity. I don't know actually if Sally wants to jump in on that, if you've thought about that question more.
Yeah, I could say that part of the answer is that Ammophila breviligulata tends to be a better competitor. And even though it doesn't grow necessarily more densely than Ammophila arenaria, it does spread out over a wider area. So it may be more competitive just because it's able to capture space and nutrients and resources better than arenaria. So that's sort of one of the hypotheses that we've had, is that Ammophila breviligulata, because it's a better competitor, outcompetes native plants in sort of a more a better way in terms of capturing resources. But good question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And thanks for
Sally.
hopping in, Sally. And there was one more question, and then I think we'll close out. So Kristen asks, just to be clear, is the hybrid grass thought to be something good that should be encouraged, or should be regarded as an even more virulent form of invasive grass?
Yeah, this is a really important question, Christian. And I think the answer is that we don't yet know the effect that this hybrid is going to have on the dunes. But at this point, I think we need to treat it with caution. So we need to say, we know that hybridization can increase the invasive potential of plants and the invasive ability of plants. So we should treat this hybrid as though it could be invasive, and we need to learn much more about it as quickly as we can so that we can understand the potential consequences. I think it's unlikely that we would find that the hybrid is something good that should be encouraged, that we would spread, although there is a small possibility that there could be some sort of dune building utility for it. I think the most likely outcome is that we need to learn a lot more about it so that we can assess the effect that it could have on the dunes.
And as you said, talking about that, watching that crossbreeding happening in the late July or whatever, to be very excited about that. Another good reason.
Absolutely.
So there is Rebecca's information there. If we are having a training on the 29th, that's 2 weeks from today. So for those of you that would like to be involved, right now the project reaches, or the findings reach down to about Pacific City area. And so for those of you Coast Watchers who are down there and want to look right around that area would be excellent, I think, to see if we can find more. And then be in between, was it I mean, the whole North Coast, right?
The whole North Coast, yeah.
But I think that there were some places that definitely could use more surveys for sure. And so this is recorded, a session, and so you'll be able to watch this, but of course you can also contact Rebecca. And then I have created a Zoom link for that training, and we may do a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar so that we can all see each other and meet each other. Maybe creating some teams around this might be fun. Of course, because we are still in quarantine and it just seems that things are very kind of scarily flexible out there. We are still encouraging people to walk their mile and collect data, but to do it safely, this is something you can definitely do on your own. You could take someone with you and keep your distance and go, but it'll be fun to meet up in these Zoom rooms with each other and learn more, learn how to work iNaturalist. If you're interested in learning how to, get iNaturalist onto your phone and start this, we can certainly help in that training. So that'll be great. I'm going to share my screen and just to show folks my contact information here. And but thank you very much, Rebecca, for being here, and Sally. I don't know where you went, but you're there somewhere. Thank you, Sally. And this has been a great morning. Thanks for spending your morning with us. And this will be on our YouTube channel. So please contact me, Jessie@OregonShores.org, and I will give you that link. And that link will also be on our website as well. That's www.OregonShores.org. Wednesday evening, we have another webinar. We will be talking to Rocky Shores Habitat Panel, as I was talking about in the very beginning. And so please contact me if you would like to be included in that webinar. And we also, one more, this Thursday night, we have an extra thing, and we are going to be partnering with Surfrider and Cape Falcon Marine Reserve for the story of plastic, screening on the story of plastic. And we will also be having a panel with Megan Ponder, who was a producer on that film, and she has also started a new organization called Peak Plastic Foundation. And we will also have a representative from Recology joining us after that as well to talk about North Coast recycling, just any questions that you have. So let me know if you would like to be involved in that, and I will send you a link for that. In the meantime, I want to say goodbye to Rebecca, and that we'll see you in a couple of weeks. And this has been really great.
Great. Thank you, Jessie.
Thanks, Jessie. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah, Sally, and I'd love to see you again in the future, very soon. So
yeah, definitely.
Training, and hopefully I'll see you sooner than that. Okay. Great. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.